He's the newly crowned middleweight champion of the world, a man who has now gone 3-0 against one of the pound-for-pound greatest fighters on the planet. Alex Pereira has captured UFC gold in the most unlikely of fashions, putting some real distance between him and his old kickboxing rival Israel Adesanya by finishing him in two different sports. But Poatan has always been known for his ability to upset the odds, and for this video, that's exactly what we're going to take a look at. Here are 10 times Alex Pereira shocked the MMA world. First blood. Okay, so technically this had nothing to do with MMA when it happened, but even though this video is focused on Pereira's career as a mixed martial artist, we still have to draw attention to the shocking result that set the whole thing in motion. Alex Pereira was not the more technical kickboxer between himself and Israel Adesanya, but in their first clash, a somewhat controversial but competitive decision put him one up over Stylebender. However, in their eventual rematch, that's when we would see the real definitive moment of their rivalry. That knockout Pereira scored actually came during a fight he was losing, something that would be mirrored all those years later in the MMA cage. But while this most recent victory was a standing TKO, when Poatan landed on Izzy back in 2017, Adesanya went out cold. Little did we know that this knockout would set in motion a chain of events that would focus these two men for 5 years, maybe even more. An early setback. There are actually quite a few legendary fighters who suffered a defeat in their very first professional mixed martial arts bout. Chris Cyborg, Andrei Arlovsky, Rafael dos Anjos, all future UFC champions who couldn't get the job done in their first ever fight. And as it turns out, Alex Pereira can now count himself among that number. His debut matchup came under the Jungle Fight banner back in 2015, with some decent levels of hype, but nothing too crazy. Thankfully, there wasn't much of a spotlight on Poatan as he made his first walk. In the end, he would lose the bout by way of third-round submission. A setback, yes, but valuable experience to bring with him. Quick turnaround. For some fighters who have their roots already set in a different combat sport, a loss like the one Pereira suffered in his debut might be enough to see them pack their things and head back to their original home. But Alex actually decided to make a very quick turnaround, wasting no time before getting back into camp, competing less than 3 months later. And this time, he was able to finally get the win, knocking out Marcelo Cruz in the final minute of round 1. MMA return. Pereira didn't spend too much time honing his MMA skills with first-hand experience though, and by the time his record stood at 2-1, he decided to go back to kickboxing for a few years. When he finally did return to MMA, 3.5 years had passed. It was kind of surprising that he did decide to return, but unbeknownst to us, Poatan was plotting another assault on his old rival Israel Adesanya, and unbeknownst to him, it would arrive a lot quicker than most expected. In the time since his last walk to the MMA cage, he had fought and defeated the last Stylebender on 2 occasions, pushing Izzy out of the sport of kickboxing and towards his new home in MMA. Before Pereira had made his next walk to the cage, Israel was already well established as an MMA fighter, having captured middleweight gold with a second-round TKO of Robert Whittaker before defending it twice against Paulo Costa and Yoel Romero. Poatan clearly saw his destiny in front of him during this time, and like Adesanya before him, he would not take long to reach the top flight. UFC call-up. After posting a 3-1 record that culminated with his US debut knockout of Thomas Powell under the LFA banner, the UFC had seen enough to begin their attempt at fast-tracking Pereira to a title shot. In some ways, he was totally inexperienced at this level, but as a veteran of the kickboxing game, he had the type of background in combat sports that would allow him to keep his composure, and trust us, that really made a huge difference for him. Even still, seeing a 3-1 fighter getting signed by the world's biggest MMA promotion was a bit surprising, and even if he wouldn't admit it, Dana White and his team clearly only had one goal in mind when it came to Alex Pereira, the mixed martial artist. The big stage. When Pereira's UFC debut finally did come, there was certainly a mixed bag of expectations from the fans. On one hand, we knew that this guy was automatically one of the best strikers in the sport already. On the other, it seemed as though a lot of factors were working against him, and if he couldn't find his way into title contention soon, the whole MMA experiment might not be worth it. but in his promotional debut, he showed up in a big way on a pay-per-view prelim and put on a performance of the night-winning effort, KOing Andreas Michailidis in the second round with a brutal flying knee. Step 1 of the Pereira experiment was completed, but the risk levels would only increase from here onwards. Well-rounded. People really did start to take Pereira a lot more seriously as a mixed martial artist after his second UFC outing. Taking on another explosive powerhouse in Bruno Silva, the expectation was that Pereira was going to serve up another quick and brutal finish this time around. But on fight night, what we got was a performance that showed us more about Poatan than we had ever expected. On paper, yes, he clearly outstruck Silva for all 3 rounds, but this opponent was by no means out of the fight. It was a hard-fought MMA battle that showcased Pereira's improving takedown defense and how his style of striking was translating to the new rules and smaller gloves. It was by no means a perfect performance, but as experiences go, Pereira clearly put in his time during this one. Shutting Strickland up. When the UFC opted to set up a fight between the unranked Pereira and the number 6 fighter in the division, Sean Strickland, it was pretty obvious that they were set on fast-tracking him to the title shot. Strickland, who is certainly a very good fighter, also just so happened to be the best possible matchup for Pereira in that top 10. As one of the most outspoken members of the fight game, it didn't seem like Strickland was going to shoot for a takedown on Pereira when his pride was at stake. And sure enough, on fight night, he made the baffling decision to stand with one of the greatest kickboxers on the planet. Once he gauged his timing, Alex fired off a signature knockout punch, flatlining Strickland in the opening round while setting himself up for a shot at the middleweight crown. The takedown. There were too many surprises within the UFC 281 headliner to boil it down to just one entry on our list. And for this first one, we're going to focus in on the supposed wrestling advantage that many pointed to as a route to victory for the defending champion Adesanya. And to be fair, there were points in the fight where he was able to control Poatan, despite his lack of big moments on the ground. But in that second round, when Pereira starts to find his footing, he actually managed to score a late takedown on the champ. Sure, we could have guessed that his physicality and ongoing work with Glover Teixeira would give him a solid foundation to work off of, but seeing Pereira grounding Israel like that was certainly unexpected. UFC Middleweight Champion. And finally, what greater way to provide a shock to the MMA world than to upset a pound-for-pound great in the 5th round of a fight you were losing? It seems like 2022 has very much been a good year for come-from-behind title-capturing performances. And when Poatan found himself in there with his old rival Israel Adesanya, he took full advantage of his tremendous power advantage in the 5th round, finding a home for his legendary left hook in the dying embers of their fight. Now 3-0 against Izzy and the undisputed middleweight champion of the world, the Alex Pereira story has truly been one for the ages. Whether he can now keep a hold on the title or not remains to be seen, but with a rematch with Adesanya likely his next step, it's clear that 2023 will be a very interesting year for the 185-pound king. For now, Poatan will take his place in the pound-for-pound rankings this week, taking a position that will look eerily similar to his spot in the kickboxing pound-for-pound list upon his exit. If one thing's for certain, it's that the 185-pound division has received an almighty shakeup. And that will just about do it for this video, but what did you make of Alex Pereira's thunderous 5th round TKO of the great Israel Adesanya? And how do you see a rematch between these two playing out? Again, if you enjoyed today's video and want to see more, be sure to leave a like and a comment before subscribing to the channel so you can stay up to date with all of our latest uploads. Thank you for watching!